insurgencies, occupying territories and posing as alternatives to state authority. Mr. President, in today's hyper-connected world, the spread of terrorism in Africa is not a concern for African member states alone. The challenge belongs to all of us. Countering international terrorism requires effective multilateral responses. Such responses need to address terrorism together with concurrent and converging threats, and these include the worsening climate change emergency, armed conflict, poverty and inequality, lawless cyberspace, and the uneven recovery from COVID-19. The new agenda for peace envisaged as part of the Secretary-General's report on our common agenda will embrace this holistic and comprehensive approach. In a context of increasing polarization with heightened divisions stemming from the war in Ukraine, the new agenda for peace will propose ways to address new and emerging risks and revitalize our collective peace and security system. Mr. President, allow me to suggest a few ideas for the consideration of this Council to advance counterterrorism efforts in Africa. First, prevention remains our best response to terrorism, violent extremism, and other threats to peace and security. We must address the instability and conflict that can lead to terrorism in the first place, as well as the conditions exploited by terrorists in pursuit of their agendas. If terrorist and extremist views too often find a welcome home with deeply dissatisfied, marginalized, and desperate people, it's up to us to help formulate responses that address those conditions. Fostering conflict-sensitive approaches and integrating relevant policies across the United Nations entities is essential. Time and again, purely military and law enforcement responses have not only proven their limits, they've also been counterproductive. We must strike a better balance and ensure coherence and complementarity between preventive and militarized responses. There can be no sustainable development without peace, and there'll certainly be no peace without sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda and the African Union's Agenda 2063 are therefore crucial preventive tools. Second, everyone needs to be included. Addressing the many drivers of terrorism requires a whole-of-society approach that are community-based and gender-sensitive. Counterterrorism strategies have a better chance of addressing the needs and concerns of society as a whole when they capture and reflect a wide array of voices, including civil society, our minorities, young people, and the private sector. There are complex links between terrorism, patriarchy, and gender-based violence. Counterterrorism policies are often therefore strengthened by the meaningful participation and leadership of women and girls. Engaging all sectors of society requires sustained political commitment across government departments and partnerships with civil society, local communities, the private sector, and much more. Third, countering terrorism can never be an excuse for violating human rights or international law. Abuse committed under the guise of countering terrorism and violent extremism can only set us back. Successful counterterrorism policies, like all policies, must uphold the rule of law and respect international law, including human rights law. The Secretary-General's call for human rights places human rights at the center of our work at the UN, from humanitarian action to peace and security to sustainable development. This is why, in the face of deteriorating security and humanitarian situations in the Sahel region, the Secretary-General has called for renewed efforts to promote state institutions and constitutional order. And I'd like to reiterate his call as we welcome President Nana Akufo-Addo. We look forward to the recommendations of the Independent High-Level Panel on Security and Development in the Sahel for strengthening international coordination in order to effectively address the multidimensional crisis in the region. Fourth, regional organizations have a critical role to play. The challenges posed by terrorist and violent extremist groups can only be met through approaches that are adapted to local context. These are numerous regional initiatives that exist to counter terrorism in Africa, from the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin to the joint force of the G5 for the Sahel, the Accra Initiative, and the Nouakchott process. These regional arrangements require full support and durable commitment from the international community. I welcome the UN-AU Technical Working Group on Preventing Violent Extremism and Countering Terrorism, which aims to increase coordination and synergies between our two organizations. I also reiterate our appeal to the Security Council to ensure predictable funding for African Union operations authorized by this Council, including to counter terrorism. As requested by this Council, we are preparing a joint progress report on the financing of AU peace operations, which is due in April 2023. We must put in place an innovative architecture that supports African peace operations in an effective and sustainable manner. I also wish to take this opportunity to commend ECOWAS, the current and past chairs, for their efforts to tackle farmer-herders conflicts through protocols on transhumance and free movement of people and goods. The only lasting solution to the underlying drivers of conflict is through sustainable development that leaves no one behind. This leads to my fifth and final point. Preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism requires resources. The magnitude of the problem calls for bold investments. Addressing these interlinked obstacles, from economic deprivation to organized crime and governance challenges, requires sustained and predictable funding at scale. Mr. President, in concluding, I welcome the upcoming summit on counterterrorism in Africa, organized jointly by the UN Office of Counterterrorism and Nigeria in October 2023. This will be an opportunity to consider ways to strengthen the United Nations' support to counterterrorism efforts across the continent. I'm confident that today's debate will offer useful insights for this summit, bringing us closer to the solutions we need to address the threat of terrorism in Africa and help to build peaceful, stable communities and societies across the continent. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General for her briefing. And I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mohammed.
Excellence, Monsieur Your Excellency, Mr. Nana Akufo-Addo, President of the Security Council, President of the Republic of Ghana, distinguished members of the Security Council, Your Excellency, Zamina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank His Excellency Nana Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana and President of the Security Council, for having invited us to this important meeting devoted to the issues of peace, security, and combating terrorism in Africa. I express my hope of seeing new ideas and initiatives emerge at the end of this meeting, and I wish every success to the Ghanaian presidency of the Council for the current month. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, allow me to focus my remarks around two pillars. The first, relating to our ongoing quest for peace, and the second, focused particularly on the fight against terrorism and violent extremism. From Mali to Mozambique, from Somalia to the Gulf of Guinea, from Libya to Eastern DRC and via the Lake Chad Basin, the themes of peace and security torment, agitate, and mobilize the minds and attention of Africa. Even Europe, which was thought to be definitively immunized by its unfortunate experiences and its lasting prosperity, is plunging back into a devastating war, namely that between Russia and Ukraine, the consequences of which risk plunging humanity into a new tragedy of planetary scale. In Africa, terrorism and the increasingly frequent recourse to violence as a means of conquering and holding on to power are fragmenting societies and causing dozens of deaths and significant physical and psychological damage daily, with incalculable consequences on vital sectors such as health, education, and food for populations. The Security Council, a major and central competent body in this field, is being called here to consider, as it does every day, but with greater conviction and firmness, the unspeakable violence ravaging the planet and the heartbreaking misery that it creates. The failure of our systems and the vanity of our values explain the birth and the spread of this monster of our time, terrorism. The scourge has spread to Africa. Somalia, Libya, Mali, Burkina Faso, the Lake Chad Basin, Mozambique, Eastern Congo are all theaters and preferred areas for the proliferation of deadly terrorist activities today. What has the international community, of which the Security Council is the linchpin, done on issues of peace and security, and combating terrorism in particular? What precise responses have we provided to the African countries that are victims of this aggression? Let's be honest, Africa is tired of hearing promises and ending up with only disappointment. Faced with terrorism, the scale of whose damage to the continent is well known, Africa also deserves to benefit from the same prompt concern shown by its partners in other places and in other circumstances. And yet Africa has not lacked initiatives to counter this phenomenon, in particular through the ACRA initiative, designed as the ideal framework for this fight, and whose objective is to promote exchange of information as well as the conduct of joint cross-border military operations between its member states, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Togo. One can also cite the constitution of the Joint Force of the G5 Sahel, that of the Joint Multinational Force for the Lake Chad Basin, and the force in Mozambique, as well as the Nouakchott process. More recently, a regional force was also set up in Eastern DRC. In addition, the African Union has also set up a peace fund to work on prevention and to support the efforts of states that are victims of terrorist violence. As we can see, Africa is capable of mobilizing its resources and its people in this existential fight against terrorism. However, it has an urgent need for solidarity and, above all, for sustainable financial resources and technical and logistical support in order to sustainably support its own efforts to resist this scourge. The Security Council, which is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, is being called upon to act in this regard. In recent times, dangerous responses have become widespread, namely non-constitutional changes. Not only do such changes create a veritable decline in democracy, but they also represent a deceptive illusion of salvation for the African nations that fall victims to them. The result is governance practices and models that are highly detrimental to the state, to the health of states that are already weakened by numerous other negative internal and external factors. At this stage, I would like to commend President Nana Akufo-Addo's commitment to democracy, vividly demonstrated by his opposition to anti-constitutional changes, particularly during his current presidency of ECOWAS. Your Excellency, President, distinguished members of the Council, solidarity with Africa in its heroic fight against terrorism, unconstitutional changes, food, education, and health and security is an imperative international duty. Terrorism has no homeland. Its defeat in Africa is necessary in order to cut off its chances of metastasizing elsewhere. This solidarity would be in vain unless it is based on a new concept of achieving and maintaining peace by redefining a new model that is more dynamic, less bureaucratic, and above all, more proactive. Doctrinally and operationally, the concept suggested here reflects a bedrock of shared values focused around the principle of African solutions for African problems with the support of the international community. As I have already stated on many occasions, the traditional mechanisms for responding to threats to peace, building peace, and maintaining peace no longer fully correspond to the new context and new threats. Terrorism in all its forms and illegal trafficking of all kinds cannot be tackled by old models. The costs, the bureaucratic burdens, the modes of operation, and The tactical and operational redeployment of these models make them, let us say this frankly, unsuitable, inefficient, and obsolete. There is therefore an urgent need to revise the mandates of UN missions to make them effective agents in the fight against terrorism and other harmful armed groups. With regard to the African Union, we stand ready to work with the United Nations, the Secretariat, and the Council with a view to developing an innovative approach at the doctrinal and operational level. The excellent relations that we maintain with the Secretary General and the no less fruitful relations between the Peace and Security Council of the African Union and the Security Council of the UN create optimism as to the future of our partnership for peace and effectively combating terrorism. We strongly call for such collective action against this scourge and its direct and indirect causes. Our expectations for an urgent and determined response are high, and I must admit, very impatient. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mohammed for his briefing. And I now give the floor to Madam Benedicta von Scheher-Toss.
Mr. President, Madam Secretary General, and members of the Security Council, distinguished colleagues. Let me first express our appreciation to Ghana for convening this debate today and for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion. This is a topic of great importance to the European Union. The EU is a strong believer in the link between security and development. We believe that holistic approaches to security, to building peace, ensure their sustainability. The EU applies this reasoning in our developmental programs, counter-terrorism strategies, our common security and defense policy in Africa and in many countries beyond. Multilateralism is key to the promotion of peace and security, and the UN is at its core. We therefore greatly value the strategic partnership we have with the UN on peace operations and crisis management. The EU-UN Global Terrorist Threat Facility is a good example of this. Our partnership has created important synergies between the UN and EU missions on the ground. We will continue to work together, including on supporting regional counter-terrorism efforts. Our other multilateral efforts too have important roles in supporting and complementing the UN. The Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, the GCTF, is one key platform. Last September, the EU assumed the role of co-chair of the GCTF, and we made the threat of terrorism in Africa a key priority for our 2-year tenure. What does this multilateral engagement mean on the ground? The EU CTF is built on our strong presence in Africa. Several EU missions currently provide military and civilian support to African countries. The latest example is the EU training mission in Mozambique. This mission deployed last year to train and support the Mozambican armed forces with a view to protect civilians and restoring security in Cabo Delgado. 5 of our civilian missions include a counter-terrorism mandate, the capacity building in Niger, Mali, and Somalia, the border assistance mission in Libya, and the security sector reform assistance mission in the Central African Republic. Moreover, the EU continues to support African-led peace operations. Earlier this year, the EU approved 600 million in assistance to the African Union through the European Peace Facility, our financial instrument aimed at preventing conflicts, building peace, and strengthening partners. Yet despite our collective efforts to keep the threat of extremist groups at bay, we all have come to realize that this has not been enough yet. We find ourselves on the back foot in too many places, and we will need to do more if we are to be successful in them all. We will also need to cooperate better. The EU plays a role in this by bringing its 27 member states together. Many EU members have long and multifaceted relationships with the European continent, and the EU as a whole has a strong commitment to work with African nations, the African Union, and with the UN to address the growing threat of terrorism and to bolster resilience to violent extremist ideologies. Resilience to violent extremism and terrorism is a security matter, but it is equally a political matter. We cannot root out violent extremism by alone. So let's talk about prevention as well. The EU's efforts in preventing and countering violent extremism have shown real results and remain key to RCT engagement. For example, through addressing youth extremism in Kenya or intercommunal conflict in Nigeria. The EU provides around 500 million euros in support to related projects across the African continent, which strengthen local authorities, local communities, and civil society actors alike. Prevention of violent extremism and building resilience requires a whole-of-society approach, and good governance is crucial if we want to truly address the ideologies and driving forces behind emergent violent extremism. That means respect for the rule of law, human rights, and the principles of democracy and international law. This political question is primarily the responsibility of national leaders, but it will require the continued attention and, at times, action of the Security Council as well. Also make the case for actively including women and girls in our prevention approach. Often, women and girls are victims of oppressive terrorist groups, for example, in Nigeria or Niger, at the hands of Boko Haram. Of course, they also have a positive role to play, like the female-led startups in Tunisia that provide jobs in their community. Recognizing this and empowering them to be active members of society, economically, politically, and culturally, will make them and their societies more resistant to extremist influences in the long run. In closing, Mr. President, Africa requires our immediate attention to stem the risks of spillover from advancing terrorist actors. The EU is stepping up its security support to the Guinea coastal countries through the Arc of Stability policy. Allow me also here to commend Ghana for organizing the next conference on the Accra Initiative this week and for Ghana's leadership in the region. In the longer term, we not only need to further our shared security agenda, but also to foster sustainable development and improved governance. The economic and social challenges to the governments in West Africa and the Sahel are manifold and will be compounded by the impact that climate change will inevitably have in the region. Addressing that will remain a long-term shared responsibility of African nations, the UN, the EU, and other partners. You can count on the EU to remain committed, engaged, and present on the ground. Thank you very much.
I thank Madam Von Scherr-Toss for her briefing. And then I give the floor to Madam Comfort Iro.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Deputy Secretary General Mohammed, Chairperson Faki, and to Ms. Scherr-Toss for their remarks. Crisis Group is an international conflict prevention organization that has long had a special focus on Africa. I was director of the Africa program from 2011 to 2021. The issues before today are therefore of particular interest both to me personally and to Crisis Group. Crisis Group has published analysis of the African-led stabilization and counterterrorism missions under discussion today, including the G5 Sahel Regional Force and the Multinational Joint Task Force in the Chad Basin. A year ago, we published a briefing on the Africa Union Stabilization Mission in Somalia, reflecting on the Security Council debates of the time. We have focused on these missions for three reasons. First, we believe that the conflicts involving non-armed groups, including jihadi groups, will be a source of instability in Africa for some time to come. Secondly, we assess that robust African-led missions are well positioned to counter these threats and that they can only be effective if they are properly and reliably resourced. Like it or not, the best way to resource these missions is through some sort of UN mechanism. Thirdly, and perhaps provocatively in the context of this debate, Crisis Group also believes that these stabilization missions alone cannot stem the threat of non-state armed groups. There is a role for the use of force against jihadists. The military operations that come as part of robust stabilization and counterterrorism missions are a crucial component of any effort against such groups. But those operations must be subordinate to a political strategy. They should be part of a broader set of responses, including projects to provide basic services and better governance to populations in areas where non-state armed groups have gained influence. And at times, although it is hard, that political strategy must contemplate engaging in dialogue with non-state armed groups, often seen as taboo to both resolve both humanitarian and political issues. I'll return to this call for dialogue at the end of my remarks, but let me first make the case for supporting regionally led stabilization operations to counter non-state groups. The case for investing in stability in Africa hardly needs repetition here. The continent is now the center of civil wars in the world. Jihadi groups are often actors in those wars. Non-state armed groups and jihadi organizations both fuel and profit from these conflicts, building power bases in places where state control is minimal or non-existent due to violence. Jihadists have tended to gain strength in places where state has collapsed, often moving in to exploit opportunities in existing war zones. In some cases, notably Mali, the Security Council has sent blue helmet peacekeepers as part of the response to such threats. But UN peacekeeping forces are not designed or equipped to fight extended counterterrorism campaigns, as we have seen in Gao and Kidal. Such operations are not formally part of blue helmet mandates, but often other components of the mandate, such as civilian protection, inevitably entail confrontation with militants. As Crisis Group has recently argued, this council should do a serious stock-taking of UN forces like MINUSMA are fit for purpose in such cases. But if blue helmets cannot do the job, who can? African-led stabilization operations are at least one potential answer. As Crisis Group noted over a year ago, AU forces in Somalia can claim some success in the battle against the Al-Shabaab jihadi group. Between 2011 and 2012, and at great cost to Ugandan, Burundian, Kenyan, and Somali partner forces in AMISOM, they ended Al-Shabaab's formal control of Mogadishu and Kismayo. The country's second largest city prized swathes of territory out of militants' hands and provided much needed security for 2 electoral cycles. We can now add that Somalia's most recent electoral cycle was also a success. It is hard to imagine that vote happening without the AU mission holding the line against Al-Shabaab. But missions of this type often face challenges. These include not only tough opponents, but also tense relations with the national governments and local populations they aim to assist. Yet one of the most serious headaches of missions of this type is donor fatigue. When African officials and military planners look how to tackle non-state armed groups in cases like the Sahel or Somalia, they don't just have to think about threats on the ground, they also have to worry about whether the partners who back their missions will keep providing the necessary financial and other resources they need to deliver on their mandate. That makes medium and long-term planning that is crucial for such operations very difficult. Policymakers in countries often, but not only in North America and Europe, and often members of this council that fund these missions face mirror image of the same problem. For these donors, it is hard to assess whether resources they offer will have real impact. In the case of Somalia last year, Crisis Group looked at both African and Western perceptions of stabilization operations in the country. We found that European donors in particular appreciated the risk African troops took, but feared that they were funding an expensive status quo. So it behooves this council to ask how to offer missions authorized by the African Union more systematic and predictable funding to allow them to plan, operate, and deliver better. The topic is hardly new. You know that the Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council have been debating how to provide AU missions with reliable funds for years. Many studies have concluded that the only credible option is a mechanism to enable the Security Council to direct UN-assisted contributions to African-led stabilization missions. Crisis Group agrees with this analysis, although in every individual crisis and conflict, both the UN and AU will need to explore if an African-led mission is the right operational choice.